However, if Sunny simply accepted the paradoxical existence of the plagues as fact, everything would fall into place. For example, the fact that Windflower had met both the Mad Prince and Sunny, just like Effie and Jet coexisted with Devouring Beast and Undying Slaughter, Sunny coexisted with the memories of his previous self. The vile madman was gone, but the scars he had left on the great river remained. Like Weave, which he had destroyed. Or Ankh, whom he doomed to a life of loneliness and loss. So, how did it all happen? Sunny contemplated the third nightmare, numb to his surroundings. The first thing he had to admit was that he did not know, and would most likely never learn, what the initial shape of the nightmare had been. The reality of the great river had been irrevocably changed by the 6 plagues. So, the challenge the original cohort had faced was entirely different. It were the 6 plagues, after all, who had taken control of Verge and led the forces of the defilement to devour the cities of the river people, undoubtedly accelerating the demise of the river civilization. Without them, the cohort might have found many powerful allies to aid them in slaying the first Seeker. However, during that first cycle, something had gone wrong. Somehow, the cohort ended up entering the source instead of laying siege to Verge. No, not quite right. It was possible that everyone had entered the source, but not necessarily so. Sunny could have attempted to find the estuary alone, for some reason. But he definitely had entered the mist and crossed the boundary. That was how the first cycle had ended. And, therefore, an unknown number of cycles began. Eventually, influenced by the hideous truth, enchantment of the sin of solace, Sunny had grown immune to losing his memory of the past cycles. Becoming a variable. A single variable that broke the system, introducing chaos to a predetermined flow of events. At that point, several things could have happened. Perhaps he continued to search for a way to conquer the nightmare and preserve the lives of his companions, failing cycle after cycle and eventually going mad. Perhaps, guided by unknown reasons, he continued to search for the entrance to the estuary that was hidden somewhere in the mist of the source. Perhaps, by then, he was already infected by the cursed knowledge of the defilement. In any case, eventually, there came a time when Sunny was returned to the beginning of the nightmare already harboring the seed of corruption in his mind. And that, of course, changed everything. The other members of the cohort were infected by the defilement, as well. Nephis died at their hands. Kneeling on the deck of the chain breaker, Sunny shivered. His face was deathly pale. What happened next, then? It was obvious. The Mad Prince was released from Shadow Bond, finally fulfilling his wish, becoming free. However, his freedom did not last long. Ironically, the madman was enslaved by one of the people he had surrendered to the defilement, Kai. Then, the corrupted cohort found a new goal. To conquer the nightmare and be released into the real world by obliterating the river people's civilization. And so, they somehow found a way to travel into the distant past, to the days long before the first day of the nightmare, and at the same time became foreign invaders of the new cycle. Sunny did not know how, but he had an inkling that the source and the estuary were somehow responsible for the birth of this bizarre and eerie paradox. Over time, the members of the corrupted cohort grew stronger, eventually transcending, or rather, falling deeper into corruption. Ankh had already told Sunny that it was possible for those who followed the path of ascension to reach transcendence without conquering a third nightmare. Similarly, it was possible for fallen nightmare creatures to become corrupted. The fallen terror of the Crimson Spire, for example, had been evolving into a corrupted titan when Nephis killed her. The former members of Neph's cohort achieved a similar feat inside the tomb of Ariel. And thus, the 6 plagues were born. They subjugated Verge and led the forces of the defilement to annihilate the river people. Even Twilight, the city of challengers led by the Serpent King, fell to their insidiousness and might. They should have conquered the nightmare decades ago, by all accounts. If not for the Mad Prince. An eerie, twisted smile appeared on Sunny's lips. Conquering the nightmare was what the Dread Lord wanted. But it was not what his slave wanted. And so, the vile madman conspired against his master. It seemed that the Mad Prince was still harboring a desperate obsession. One that had nothing to do with spreading the defilement to every corner of the tomb of Ariel, obliterating the river civilization, or unleashing the 6 plagues into the real world. Sunny did not know what that obsession was. But he could guess. Be careful of what you wish for. Those were the words that the Mad Prince had carved into the piece of flotsam drifting in the mist of the source, over and over again, with his nails. It wasn't hard to guess that he regretted fulfilling his wish. What did Sunny want? To be free. That wish of his had killed Nephis. He shuddered. The Mad Prince, that bastard, was that what he wanted to achieve? To rewrite history and ensure that Nephis survives? Perhaps. And so, the Mad Prince started scheming as he prepared for the arrival of the members of the cohort. He trapped Undying Slaughter and Devouring Beast on Alethia's island. He had met with Windflower and learned how to create the Estuary Key. He massacred Weave, and then sent a dream message to Ankh, instructing her to meet Sunny and Nephis in the far reaches of the future when the time came. And gods knew what else. Sunny simply did not know the extent of preparations the Mad Prince had undertaken to ensure that, in this cycle, the events of the nightmare went exactly as he planned. The reality of the Great River had already been entirely changed from how it had originally been by the existence of the 6 plagues. And the vile madman manipulated it even more, purposefully setting the stage for his future self. And then, when all the preparations were done, he simply entered the source and ceased to exist, transferring the Estuary Key to Sunny, ensuring that he would not be poisoned by the defilement immediately after entering the nightmare, unlike how it had happened in the previous cycles. And here they were. Sunny let out a long sigh. That treacherous madman. Chapter 1490 No Bounds. Audiobook made by the Nut Lord. None of the text used in this audiobook belongs to me. Please support the original author online. This is a fan-made project and I make no money from it. Also join the Discord for a lot of more audiobooks too. Truly, a treachery that knew no bounds. Sunny had succumbed to the defilement and betrayed the cohort, only to betray them once again once they were made into the 6 plagues by him, killing one of his masters in the process and weaving countless schemes to destroy the other. He did not really know how to feel about it. Was he supposed to be proud of or appalled by his former self? I might have to stop resenting the spell for calling me that. In any case, he felt a deep sense of regret, because he wouldn't be able to strangle the mad bastard with his own 2 hands. Sunny sighed. Well, there it was. The truth. Of course, there were still many things that made little sense, or no sense at all. The most obvious of them, of course, was the paradoxical existence of the 6 plagues, who had not only traveled to the distant past of the river civilization, but also lingered in the tomb of Ariel despite the start of a new cycle. They really broke all the rules. Sunny also did not know where the Mad Prince had found the chain breaker before arranging for it to be discovered by him and Nephis. He also did not know why the vile madman destroyed Weave, denying them the support of the followers of Weaver, and many other things. Some of them, he was probably never going to learn. But it was all right. The tomb of Ariel had never been a place that could be fully understood by a mere mortal. And he already knew the general shape of things. So what? That knowledge, really, did not change anything at all. Their goal remained the same. Travel to Twilight, retrieve Kai and Mordret, then gather whatever strength they can and attack Verge to slay the first Seeker. If anything, that goal had only become less impossible to achieve. Not only were 3 of the 6 plagues already off the board, but there was no telling what else the Mad Prince had arranged to help the cohort conquer the nightmare. Were the rest of the plagues even alive? Perhaps he had already dealt with them, the same way he had dealt with Devouring Beast and Undying Slaughter. What is this weird feeling? It is as if I'm being helped by myself, from beyond the grave, and not only that, but that dead version of me is also a truly dreadful nightmare creature. Had a more bizarre sentence ever been spoken? Although, technically, Sunny did not speak it aloud. And the Mad Prince was not technically dead, just erased from existence by traveling back in time. Yeah, that definitely does not sound just as bizarre. At that moment, Sunny realized that he had been kneeling on the deck of the chain breaker for quite some time, staring at the distant Great River and spacing out. It must have been quite a strange sight. Before he could look around, however, a shadow fell on him. Raising his head, Sunny saw the Sin of Solace, who was looking at him with a dark expression. Fool, are you done acting like an idiot? Oh, wow. Judging by your stupid expression, that idiot brain of yours finally managed to digest some information. Pathetic. How long has it taken you to realize something that should have been apparent on day 1? Sunny stared at the sword wraith, then smiled darkly. You know. I know. You rotten bastard. How many times have you poisoned me with the defilement? Indeed, the Sin of Solace was the reason Sunny had become the Mad Prince. But, strangely enough, the sword wraith was also the reason why the Mad Prince had managed to preserve a shred of lucidity, keeping him forever torn between 2 mutually exclusive states, and, therefore, forever in agony. How sinister. Sunny's eye twitched. Answer me, you piece of trash. The Sin of Solace stared at him, fury burning in his eyes. He clearly wanted to say something, but he couldn't. The estuary key forbade him. Not only that, but it also prevented the innate connection that Sunny shared with the splintered piece of his mind from serving as a conduit for subconscious knowledge about the previous cycles of the Great River and the secrets of the estuary. And, on top of that, that memory was the first one Sunny had ever seen that functioned even without being summoned. Its passive enchantment was in effect despite the estuary key resting within his soul, both silencing the sword wraith and preventing time from influencing the jagged piece of black rock. Amazing. Just how skilled of a sorcerer had he become after countless years of being a corrupted titan? Sunny sighed. It did not matter. The cost was much too high. It was unbearable. Nevertheless, the key of the estuary was a promise of what he could potentially achieve, one day. Right. The others might be concerned about me suddenly going catatonic. Or maybe, they were petrified by dire revelations of their own. Looking back, Sunny saw the members of the cohort. Cassie was staring at the distant ribbon of the Great River, her expression distant. She must have realized the same things Sunny had, perhaps even more. Nephis was even more expressionless than usual. She seemed to have grasped the truth, as well. Jet and Effie, however, knew less about the tomb of Ariel. It did not appear that they were interested in the sight of the Great River at all. Instead, they were on the opposite side of the chain breaker, staring into the darkness beyond. By then, the inertia carrying the flying ship forward had mostly dissipated. They were slowing down. Nephis sighed. So that is what the vortex is. Sunny glanced at her in confusion. What? She pointed at the Great River. It's flat. Although its shape makes it so that the entirety of the river is one plane, there are actually two sides to it. The tunnel we traveled through is simply a passage that connects one side to the other. In other words, we did not descend to the bottom of the Great River. We simply passed through it, emerging from the other side. And at some point, they were catapulted out of the vortex at such a tremendous speed that the chain breaker soared high above the surface of the river. How long was it going to take them to come back? Sunny winced. We don't even know how long we spent on Alethia's island. Months could have passed, years, even, before I became aware of the loop. Was Kai doing fine? What about Fallen Grace? How were that brat Kronos and its other residents faring? We need to return as soon as possible. There was also Effie and her baby. Sunny did not know what would happen if she gave birth within the seed. Would the baby, who had been conceived in the waking world, be a riverborn or an outsider? What would happen to it after they conquered the nightmare? Children are resilient. There was a reason why the spell infected young people. Young souls were much more malleable, and could withstand the awakening better. Of course, no infant had even been sent into the first nightmare, so there was no telling what would happen. This was not a first nightmare, either. It was the third. If they conquered it, would Effie's child become a saint as an infant? Or would the child's soul collapse under the strain of transcendence? Sunny did not know. Damnation. He remained silent for a while, then shook his head. It's going to be fine. I refuse to believe that it won't. Just as he thought that, Effie suddenly cursed. In the next moment, Jet yelled. Stop this damn ship right now. Chapter 1491 Dark Boundary. Sunny, the sails. Before Jet's shout even faded, Cassie and Sunny were already moving. He called upon the shadows to raise the sails of the chain breaker, while she rushed to the runic circle. Nephis turned to look into the darkness, her hand resting on the hilt of her sword. What kind of disaster have we stumbled into now? Grasping the steering oars, Cassie skillfully turned the ship to borrow the force of the wind. At the same time, the runic circle ignited, absorbing strands of her essence. Now that the enchantment circuits were repaired, it was not to power the sorcery of the ancient vessel, but simply to control it. Finally, the chain breaker came to a halt, hovering in the boundless darkness of the tomb of Ariel. Sunny approached Jet and Effie, tracing their gazes into the distance. What is the matter? His voice faltered. Out there, far away. The world ended. It was hard to see, even for Sunny, because the end of the world was perfectly black, barely distinguishable from the darkness that surrounded them. But still, there was a vast, seemingly endless surface in front of them, stretching in all directions as far as the eye could see, like a boundary of the world. Smooth and lusterless, like polished stone. It took him a moment to realize what he was looking at. It's the inner wall of the pyramid. The endless black boundary was just that, the wall of Ariel's tomb, seen from the inside. However, it dwarfed anything he had ever seen. The towering walls of the dark city were like a speck of dust in front of it. The great ramparts of Fal Kunscot were like sand. Looking at the endless black wall, Sonny was stunned by its sheer magnitude. For a moment, he wondered, was the interior of the pyramid truly large enough to encompass an entire realm, or was it him who had been reduced to the size of an ant? Well, in any case, Jet's warning had come in time. The chain breaker was not going to crush into the endless wall of black stone anymore. They had already stopped, and there was plenty of distance between them and the boundary of Ariel's dreadful world. But then, a slight frown appeared on his face. Turning to Jet, Sonny remained silent for a moment. He could see the surface of the wall because of how special his sight was. She, however, did not share his ability to see in the darkness. So how had Jet and Effie known to warn them? What is it? The huntress was looking forward with a somber expression. She remained silent for a moment, then grimaced. Can't you smell it? It reeks of nightmare creatures. Sonny slowly shook his head and glanced at Jet, raising an eyebrow. Her icy blue eyes were radiating a chilling cold. There are souls, powerful souls, far ahead. Soul Reaper was usually easygoing and relaxed, but now, her expression was grave. Seeing it, Sonny felt a shiver run down his spine. His frown deepened. Jet wouldn't be wary of just any soul. What kind of power? Cursing inwardly, he turned to the distant black boundary and strained his eyes, trying to discern something, anything, to understand what was threatening them. Knowing that Sonny had the best chance of discovering the hidden threat, the rest of the cohort fell silent. What is it? I can't see anything. Now that his initial shock of witnessing the inner wall of the tomb had subsided, Sonny could study it in more detail, not that there was a lot to study. It was just a solid black surface, stretching endlessly into the darkness. He was too far away to notice anything else. Well, if there was one thing, it was that the wall was not smooth, as he had initially thought. Rather, it was uneven, as if covered in countless ridges and bumps. Those ridges and bumps looked tiny from afar, but they should be dozens, if not hundreds, of meters across. Sonny peered at the irregularities, thinking. There might be something hiding in the seams. Maybe there are caves in the stone? I don't see any entrances, though. Then, he suddenly froze. Out there on the wall of the Black Pyramid, something had just moved. The movement was tiny and at the very periphery of his vision, so if Sonny had not been looking at the wall of Ariel's tomb intently, he would not have noticed it. Turning his head slightly, he stared at a particular spot. What was it? He still couldn't see any creatures hiding in the recess between the strange, irregular ridges. Then, his perception shifted slightly. It was just a mundane shift, like concentrating on a near object instead of a distant one, as well as a mental one, like trying to perceive something as a part of a whole instead of a separate entity. It was at this moment that Sonny's hair stood on end, and his face became as pale as that of a ghost. Instantly petrified, he swayed slightly. Damnation! Powerful souls! There was nothing hiding in the recesses of the endless wall. There were no caves hidden between the bumps and ridges where dreadful abominations could dwell. Instead, the entire surface of the wall was covered by abominations, who clung to it like moths. The bumps and ridges were the edges of millions of black wings. The inner wall of Ariel's tomb was obscured by a colossal swarm of numerous dark butterflies. There were myriads of these eerie great monsters resting on the endless black surface, seemingly asleep, but also ready to awaken if anything disturbed their slumber. Sonny took an involuntary step back. This is the place Song and Vela wanted to conquer. One great monster was a calamity that only a few people in the waking world could quell. But there were countless dark butterflies dwelling inside the Black Pyramid, protecting its boundary, waiting for some fool to set them free. Or maybe waiting to destroy anyone who would try to desecrate the tomb that the Demon of Dread had built. Sonny shuddered. Ariel, that lunatic, just what did he build? And why? Turning his head slowly, he looked at Cassie with hollow eyes and asked quietly, "Cassie, can you extinguish the radiance of the sacred tree?" She seemed confused for a moment, then nodded. In the next moment, the beautiful light of the rustling tea grew dimmer, eventually disappearing entirely. Sonny let out a shaky sigh. The lanterns illuminating the chain breaker were extinguished, as well. Soon, the members of the cohort found themselves in absolute darkness. Only Sonny and Cassie could move freely in the absence of light. Unable to look away from the harrowing sight of countless black butterflies crowding the surface of the endless stone wall, he calmed his wildly beating heart and said in a hoarse whisper, "Cassie, take us away from here. Back to the river, fast." As fast as you can. The chain breaker moved, slowly turning its bow. The creaking of the masts, the rustle of leaves, and the ripple of the billowing sail sounded like thunder to his ears. If they notice us, we die. I have survived many situations in which I had no business surviving. But this one, there's no surviving that. They had to get away. Sonny gritted his teeth and waited. A few moments passed, then a few moments more. A minute. The chain breaker was gliding toward the distant great river, steadily gaining speed. Faster, faster. Sonny never expected that he would be praying to return to the great river one day. But here he was, doing just that. Perhaps someone had heard his prayers. Eventually, the dreadful wall of Ariel's tomb disappeared from view, and the beautiful ribbon of the great river drew closer. Chapter 1492. Back to the river. The chain breaker escaped from the slumbering legion of the monstrous butterflies, traveling further and further away from the endless black surface of the pyramid's wall. Sonny counted the seconds, afraid that a dark cloud would rise into the air and chase them. Tense silence permeated the air, and none of the cohort members spoke. Powerful winds wandered the hollow darkness around them. The space itself was acting strangely, making it feel as if the world was not quite right. The distant ribbon of the great river was drawing nearer at tremendous speed. After a while, he took a deep breath. We should be safe now, right? He wasn't sure. Sonny had thought that he knew a lot about the tomb of Ariel, but now, he felt that the unassuming demon was far more sinister and mysterious than it seemed. And why wouldn't he have been? Ariel did not leave that strong of an impression, true, but that was only in comparison to his three harrowing siblings, Weaver, Nether, and Hope. The demon of dread was still a true deity, though, a being capable of challenging the gods and tearing down the heavens. Of course, this pyramid of his would be just as dreadful. In fact, it was a testament to how adaptable people were that Sonny had learned to take this terrible place for granted, a tomb built from the body of an unholy titan, containing a mystical river created from the titan's blood. Was he insane to hope that they could escape its boundary unscathed? But in the end, they did escape. None of the dark butterfly had awakened or rushed to pursue them, allowing the chain breaker to freely dive into the darkness. The space itself rippled and flowed, streaming past the flying ship like liquid. It was a strange feeling. They were descending toward the great river much faster than it should have been possible. Eventually, Sonny let out a relieved sigh. We are safe. I think. Hearing him, Cassie allowed the sacred tree to shine once again, and its soft light enveloped the deck. The members of the cohort glanced at each other, their faces full of weariness and fatigue. The last few days had not been easy on them, and the days before that had been even more dire. Jet looked back with a bleak expression. What the hell was there, in the darkness? The others looked at Sonny, as well. He remained silent for a moment, then shrugged. The wall of the pyramid. And on that wall, countless great monsters, crowding its surface like horrid mold. Thankfully, they seemed to be slumbering, and none noticed us. The members of the cohort were dismayed, and he could easily understand why. The words countless and great monsters were not supposed to ever appear next to each other. And yet, here in the tomb of Ariel, they did. Seriously, now, I understand why there are only a few dozen saints in the world. Surely, this particular third nightmare was more dreadful than the rest. But not by much, most likely. Saint Tyrese, Beastmaster, Bloodwave, Wake of Ruin, and the other Transcendents, all of them had survived harrowing trials similar to this one. Sonny had never underestimated the saints, but he found a new sense of admiration for them. No wonder most of them seemed so distant. Shaking his head, Sonny gazed at the great river and let out a sigh. Anyway, I don't think that there is anyone between us and the river. So, we should be safe for now. Without saying anything, they stood together in silence and looked at the colorful ribbon that floated in the darkness far, far away. Eventually, Nephis spoke. Then, we need to decide what to do next. The chain breaker hovered in the emptiness, illuminated by the soft radiance of the sacred tree. Saint stood guard on its bow, while Fiend crouched near the runic circle at its stern. A motionless figure in red garments could be seen under the glowing branches. It was the echo of the Sibyl that Cassie had summoned, finally restored after sustaining severe damage on Alethia's island. However, there were no humans in sight. All 5 of them were below the deck, sharing a meal. They were too exhausted to come up with plans, but had no other choice. It was necessary to decide where to land, now that they were returning to the great river. After everyone had satiated themselves, there were a few minutes of silence. Eventually, Sonny spoke. Well, our primary goal remains the same. We need to find Kai and the other guy in Twilight. Hopefully, there will be other fighters there to help us take on Verge. Jet gave him a curious look. Other fighters? I thought that Twilight was destroyed. Sunny hesitated for a few moments. No one really knows what happened to Twilight. Technically, it was not destroyed, just lost. Whatever that means. We had the idea that there might be survivors there simply because, otherwise, this nightmare seems to be impossible. His expression dimmed. That was before, though. Now, any preconceived notions we had about the nightmare are meaningless. We don't even know if the remaining plagues are still alive, or how many defiled are left in Verge. Perhaps their power has dwindled enough for the spell to decide that we can handle it all ourselves. No, even that is a fundamentally false assumption, because the balance of forces within the nightmare has been tempered with. As he finished speaking, Cassie added, "Our plan was to explore Windflower, Alethia's island, to find you two, then return to Fallen Grace, regroup, and sail for Twilight. However, the situation is a bit different now, because we can reach both cities from up here. We can even travel directly to Verge, not that it's a good idea." Nephis nodded. "So, what we need to decide today is whether we want to go directly to Twilight, or recuperate at Fallen Grace first." Effie and Jet glanced at each other. Neither of them had been to Fallen Grace or knew a lot about Twilight. At the same time, due to the difference in how the members of the cohort had experienced time in the nightmare, they were the most exhausted of the five. Sunny, Nephis, and Cassie had spent more time inside the tomb of Ariel, but they at least had plenty of downtime between the many harrowing ordeals. Effie and Jet, however, never had an opportunity to rest. After a few moments of silence, Effie smiled. "What's the point of delaying the inevitable? Let's go directly to where Knight and that Vela Princeling are. Wait, or is he a Song Princeling now? Anyway, the sooner we get them, the sooner we can escape this damned nightmare." Jet grinned. "I agree. I consider myself a very patient woman, you know. I waited for a long, long time to get a chance at transcendence. But now, my patience is running thin. Let's conquer this nightmare as soon as possible." She secretly threw a glance at Effie's belly, but did not at anything else. Sunny sighed. "Well, then." He looked at Nephis, remained silent for a moment, and nodded. "It's unanimous. We are going to Twilight, I guess." Chapter 1493 Sins of the Past. The plan of action was clear. In the next, however long it was going to take, the chain breaker would traverse the empty darkness and return to the Great River. They would aim to land as close to Twilight as possible. Granted, no one knew where the lost city was located, exactly. All they knew was that it was situated in the reaches of the Great River where the sky was painted lilac by the light of dawn, as well as the general era when it had been established. The latter was inscribed on the slates recovered from the drowned temple. So, Cassie was going to guide the chain breaker to the stretch of the river corresponding to that era, and they would explore the currents from there. Sunny felt a bad premonition when he thought about Twilight, and the blind girl seemed troubled, as well. Neither knew what was waiting for the cohort there, but, whatever it was, two things were certain. First, that they were going to face a trial no less dangerous, and most likely far more terrible, than anything they had experienced in the tomb of Ariel yet, which was saying a lot, considering how utterly dreadful Alethia's island had been. Second, that the Mad Prince had to have arranged something to happen in Twilight, as well. There were 4 fixed events in each cycle, after all, Nephis and Sunny entering the tomb of Ariel in the far reaches of the future, upstream of Weave, Cassie entering the nightmare in Fallen Grace, Effie and Jet entering the nightmare among the river nomads, and Kai entering the nightmare somewhere near Twilight, accompanied by Mordred. It would be strange if the Mad Prince had not included the lost city in his schemes. Something unspeakable is waiting for us there. I can feel it. Sunny's expression was bleak. Nevertheless, he felt strangely hopeful. Precisely because the Mad Prince had most likely already done something to give them a chance, no matter how small. Was it arrogance, to have faith in the devious nature of his former self? He did not know, and he did not care. Additionally, Sunny had 2 more hidden advantages. The crown of Twilight he wore was going to grant him a nearly inexhaustible reserve of essence in the land, waters, of Constant Dawn. More than that, it was a key to the defensive arrays of Twilight. All he had to do to gain control of them was reach Daeron's throne room. He and Nephis were 2 of the most powerful masters in history, and their power only became greater when they were together. Jet received her aspect legacy, while Effie could inspire all three of them with her ascended ability and support the cohort from the back with javelins. There was Cassie, as well, the unassuming seer who was actually the hidden ace of the cohort. Her affinity to mysteries and revelations could resolve many problems that would otherwise be unsolvable, and warn them of the most dire threats in advance. So, overall, he judged that their chances of tackling Twilight were not bad. Right now, however, Sonny hid his face behind a cup of tea and furtively studied the faces of his companions. There was another conversation they had to have. He sighed. This is silly. They had not discussed the revelations about the nature of the Great River, the true identity of the Six Plagues, and his own role in all that had happened yet. It was indeed stupid to feel ashamed of the actions of his defiled past version, but he was. How did one go about telling his friends that he had turned them all into nightmare creatures in the past life? Or maybe even in countless past lives? It is probably just as awkward as telling the girl you're in love with that you killed her. Sonny coughed. But then again, adding that your evil version betrayed the other, defiled and brutally slaughtered countless innocent people just to create a future where she remains alive, should count for something, right? I mean, it's a bit romantic. Right? He suppressed the desire to groan and looked away. What was this insanity? Who else had a life as unhinged as his? Eventually, Sonny sighed. Now, let's talk about the Great River itself. You should have realized something after seeing it from afar. I realized a few things, as well, and they might very well affect how this nightmare ends. Trying to keep his voice neutral, Sonny shared what he had deduced. The cyclical nature of the Great River, the existence of the source and how the past and the future were connected through it, the fact that it wasn't their first time challenging the nightmare, the commonalities between the Great Loop of the river and the artificial loop of Alethia's island. Among those commonalities was his ability to slowly become aware of the repeating nature of time, which led to his eventual defilement, and, therefore, to the defilement of the rest of the cohort and Nefer's death. Lastly, Sonny explained why he thought that the Mad Prince was gone, and how the influence of his demented predecessor was still affecting everything that was happening on the Great River, and in particular to them. He did, however, keep a few things to himself, for example, the fact that the vile madman had been enslaved by the Dread Lord, as well as why the Mad Prince had been so obsessed with rewriting the past. In the end, Sonny took a deep breath and said, his voice a bit stifled. So, sorry, I guess. You know, for creating the Six Plagues. The other members of the cohort stared at him silently for a while. He winced. You can at least say something, damn it. At that moment, Jet chuckled. What are you apologizing for? It's not your fault. You and I both watched over people who failed their first nightmare and became nightmare creatures, so you should know better than most that the person is not to be blamed for what the abomination does. Effie looked at him with a mischievous smile. Right. But, since we're apologizing for what our evil twins did, sorry for squishing you like a bug. A very small, teeny-tiny, squishy bug. That's what Devouring Beast did, right? Should I feel guilty about it, as well? Nephis shook her head. We don't know what happened during our first cycle in the nightmare, and how you ended up entering the source. Perhaps the rest of us were already dead by then, so you might have saved us all, to begin with. The only thing that matters is what happens in this cycle, and making it the last. Cassie didn't say anything, and simply nodded. Sonny sighed. He didn't really feel responsible for the actions of the Mad Prince, but it was still nice to know that his companions had his back, no matter what. At that moment, Effie leaned back and said, on that note, Doofus, can you tell your chest to stop trying to bite my arm off? I know there are still plenty of tasty things inside. I won't take much, well, all of it, at least. He laughed. Go get your own tasty things. Do you think we don't see you wolfing down those berries from your locket without sharing them with anyone? As the members of the cohort moved past the identity of the Mad Prince and started to discuss the bizarre secrets of the Great River, his gaze brushed past Cassie. The blind girl was listening quietly, cradling a cup of tea in her hands. For a moment, a shadow ran across Sonny's face. He had become aware of the loop on Alethia's island, but hadn't Cassie become aware of it, too? Wouldn't the same have happened with the cycles of the Great River, then? And, unlike him, she didn't have the estuary key to prevent her from remembering. Sonny studied the blind girl for a moment, then shook his head. No, that was impossible. Back on Alethia's island, Cassie must have regained her memories because of being exposed to the sin of solace through him, even if she had never admitted it. So, the restriction placed on the sword wraith was protecting her, too. Otherwise, it would be not Cassie, but torment sitting across the table from him. Watching as the blind girl took a sip of her tea, and then smiled at Effie's joke, he finally allowed himself to relax. There was little time left for them to rest and recuperate. Once the chain breaker reached twilight, Sunny had a feeling that none of them would have an opportunity to rest for a long while. Chapter 1494 The Edge. Standing on the deck of the chain breaker as it barreled through the empty darkness, Sunny felt a strange mix of horror and exhilaration. That was because the distance they had to cover could only be called cosmic. He did not know how far the Great River was from the walls of the pyramid, exactly, but it had to be an astronomical number of kilometers, perhaps not as immense as the distance between Earth and the Moon, but of a similar proportion. If so, logically, it would take them years to return. However, space itself was acting strange in the interior of the tomb of Ariel. Judging by how fast the Great River was drawing closer, they were going to reach it in a matter of days, or weeks at most. In any case, it didn't stop Sunny from imagining that he was on a spaceship. Come to think of it, can the chain breaker travel through space? It probably could, considering that the force propelling the flying vessel was sorcerous in nature. However, that didn't mean that the helmsman and the passengers would survive space. So, this was probably as close as Sunny would ever get to being a taikonaut, a cosmonaut, astronaut, whatever the word was. Not the least because, according to Jet, Earth's orbit hid dangers that even she wasn't qualified to know about. With a sigh, he looked away from the great river and went to sit beneath the branches of the sacred tree. He preferred to spend his time leaning on Ananke's ketch, but the Sin of Solace was less likely to bother him here. Therefore, Sunny reluctantly abandoned his previous spot. With only a few precious days left before they returned, he wanted to concentrate on weaving. There were 5 supreme soul shards inside the covetous coffer, and Sunny still remembered his sincere desire to make the cohort as strong as possible. Sadly, even after studying the soul arsenals of his companions, he didn't find a memory that could be easily elevated to the supreme rank. There were a number of transcendent memories between the 5 of them, but very few that were both suitable and within his ability to modify. The only real exception was the Sin of Solace. Sunny felt that he could elevate the rank of the Cursed Jian rather swiftly. However, he was wary of making it any stronger. Before, Sunny had only been concerned about making the Sword Wraith more powerful. Now, he also had to worry about the relationship between the Sin of Solace and the Estuary Key. The Sin of Solace was a transcendent memory of the 5th tier, while the Estuary Key was a supreme memory of the 6th tier. Was it really a coincidence that the key was exactly 1 rank and 1 tier above the memory it was meant to suppress? If not, what would happen if this balance was broken by his meddling? Considering that the consequence of failure was becoming infected by the defilement, Sunny did not wish to take unnecessary risks. The Jian was already capable of cutting through great nightmare creatures with the help of the Crown of Dawn, anyway. So, Sunny was forced to lead the Supreme Soul Shards to gather dust in the covetous coffer, and turned his attention to the covetous coffer itself, instead. He was still researching a way to turn this unique memory of his into half of an echo, which would most likely allow him to make a perfectly fine shadow. Why would he want to turn the covetous coffer into a shadow? Well, for one, both the storage space, the physical size, and the flexibility of what the coffer could be turned into depended on the potency of Sunny's soul. The peculiar memory was already far greater than the small, toothy box it had been once. If Sunny became a transcendent terror, who knew what form the coffer would be able to assume? Apart from that, even after all these years and the countless horrors Sunny had experienced during them, he still remembered the Mordant Mimic as one of the most vile and troublesome creatures he had ever killed. Plus, the bastard had once belonged to Noctis, and could produce soul coins. Who wouldn't want to have a shadow like that? Entertaining himself with such thoughts, Sunny spent a few days blissfully poring over his plans to create an artificial echo, no matter how dysfunctional. They were getting closer and closer to the Great River. The distant ribbon slowly grew larger. Soon, it was already covering half of the horizon. The 7 tiny motes of lights turned into furiously radiant spheres, painting the bow of the chain breaker with stark light. Then, the great river completely obscured the darkness beyond. At that point, they were not blindly flying forward, but instead aiming for a particular stretch of it. The winds surrounding them were growing stronger, and the light of the 7 suns suffused the air, making it seem as though they were sailing through the sky once again. Finally, after slightly more than a week, they reached the edge. Sunny knew that they had arrived because a flood of essence suddenly entered his soul. Of course, in reality, it was not coming from an outside source, rather, it was the innate replenishment rate of his cores that had been enhanced by the Crown of Twilight. In any case, the Crown had recognized dawn, and so, its mystical enchantment activated. Sighing, Sunny left what he was doing and climbed to the upper deck. There, the members of the cohort had already gathered, looking forward. There, in front of them, a colossal waterfall was plummeting into the abyss, stretching in both directions as far as the eye could see. Painted in the hues of beautiful pink and lilac by the pale light of dawn, the dreamlike clouds of water vapor flowed into the darkness, sparkling with reflected sunlight. The distant roar of the impossible waterfall was like a soft whisper, "For now." It was an incredibly beautiful sight. Stunned by the magical beauty, Sunny let out a quiet sigh. Why must this dreadful place be so breathtaking? With that, he glanced at Cassie, who was holding the steering oars. Guided by her hands, the chain breaker soared above the waterfall, flew above the water for a few hours more, and finally landed on the surface of the great river. They had returned. Chapter 1495 Still Water, audiobook made by the Nutlord. None of the text used in this audiobook belongs to me. Please support the original author online. This is a fan-made project and I make no money from it. Also join the Discord for a lot of more audiobooks too. Sunny had begun the nightmare under the pure azure sky. Then, he traveled to Fallen Grace, which was bathed in the crimson light of an eternal sunset. Now, he finally reached the waters where the soft twilight of nascent dawn suffused the world with a gentle glow. The flowing waters of the great river were like a calm mirror that reflected the dreamlike palette of the vibrant morning sky. As such, it seemed as though the graceful vessel was sailing on heaven itself. It was a beautiful sight that soothed the soul and took one's breath away, if not for the dangers that lurked beneath the splendor of the wondrous current. Cassie had long used the guiding light to point the way to Kai. The fact that the sacred staff still responded to his true name filled Sunny's heart with hope. It meant that his friend was still alive, at least. Now, they were traveling downstream in search of the lost city of Twilight, where the charming archer was stranded. The problem was that instead of distancing itself from the edge, the chain breaker was instead drawing closer and closer to it. So, they had to be wary not only of the nightmare creatures hiding beneath the waves, but also of the current itself. The closer they were to the edge, the more violent the currents became, trying to pull the ship into the endless waterfall. Even now, a few days of sailing away from it, it was almost impossible to keep the chain breaker on course. In the end, Cassie had given up on struggling against the current and raised the flying ship into the air. They were staying low to the water, flying along its surface, to avoid being attacked from above, or at least have more time to react if an attack came. Of course, such a strategy also left them more vulnerable to the enemies lurking below the water. But after witnessing the dreadful swarm of monstrous butterflies, Sunny was extremely wary of the boundless expanse of the dim sky. Days slowly passed. Sunny continued to advance in his endeavor to turn the covetous coffer into an echo. Gradually, though, his mind drifted away from that riddle, turning somber and grave. His companions wore similar expressions. It was as though they were sensing the approach of a violent storm, a storm of blood, perhaps. Of a battle that was going to test the very essence of their resolve, and maybe find it lacking. Slowly but surely, the idle conversation ceased. The sounds of laughter that used to echo above the deck of the chain breaker disappeared, replaced by grim silence. An oppressive tension settled on the deck of the graceful vessel. Nevertheless, everyone remained calm and collected, preparing for battle with cold determination. Ah! I can smell it. The blood was yet to spill, but its scent had already permeated the air. Strangely enough, very few nightmare creatures attacked their ship, perhaps because even abominations struggled to stay alive this close to the edge. As the days went by, however, their numbers dwindled even further, until none remained at all. That was definitely both strange and worrisome. No place in the tomb of Ariel was supposed to be safe, and since even nightmare creatures were reluctant to venture into these waters, humans like them had to be wary, as well. On the seventh day, they finally saw something rising from above the surface of the river. As the chain breaker drew closer, and they could see the massive object more clearly, Sunny frowned. It was the carcass of an abominable leviathan, its body covered by a pale carapace. The flesh of the nightmare creature had long rotten away, leaving behind only an empty husk. A forest of arrows was rising from the cracked shell, and there were broken harpoons floating in the water around it. There were gaping holes littering the carapace, as well, as if someone had torn through it with sharp teeth, ripping out huge chunks of flesh in the process. Sunny thought that he recognized the marks left behind by those monstrous fangs. Did Daeron kill this abomination? It would make sense, considering that they were close to his city. There was something eerie about the dead nightmare creature, though. Why is it still here? This close to the edge, a powerful current pulled everything into the abyss. Judging by the look of the carcass, the abomination had been slain countless years ago. And yet, it still remained, somehow floating in place. Even the broken harpoon surrounding it had not been carried away by the water. As he frowned, Nephis spoke to Cassie, her voice carrying a hint of unease. "Don't approach." The blind seer gently pushed the steering oar, sending the chain breaker around the massive carcass. Jet studied it silently for a few moments, then asked, "What do you think happened here?" Sunny pursed his lips. "It must have been killed by the Twilight people, before the city was lost. I am not sure why it remains in this strange state, though. They were going to find out sooner or later." Leaving the troubling carcass behind, they continued to follow the guiding light. It wasn't long before they encountered more signs of the past battle. There were more dead nightmare creatures, each more terrifying than the previous one. All kinds of horrors seemed to have attacked Twilight once, a long time ago, only to be slain by the warriors of Daeron City. And these were only the ones who had resisted the pull of the current, for some reason. Who knew how many dreadful abominations really participated in the harrowing siege? The corpses were littered with all kinds of wounds. Some had been delivered by crafted weapons, some were clearly delivered by powerful memories. Some seemed to have been dealt to the nightmare creatures by the Serpent King himself, or perhaps one of the saints in his service. They also saw fields of flotsam left behind by shattered ships. The sight of floating debris was both sorrowful and ominous. After traveling across the ancient battlefield for several days, they saw relatively intact ships, as well. They were different both from the alloy behemoths of the waking world and the graceful wooden ships of the river people. Their frames were built of wood, but the hulls were plated with armor crafted from bone, shell, and hide from corrupted leviathans. Most were severely damaged, tilted, with gaping breaches in their hulls. Their masts were broken, and the plates of armor covering their sides bore terrible scars. Some were scorched, some seemed to have been partially dissolved by some unknown liquid. In other words, these broken ships looked no different from the corpses of the nightmare creatures their crew had fought against. Dead, abandoned, and forgotten. If there was one thing in common between all of them, though, it was that there was not a living soul aboard. Only bones wearing shredded armor. Everything was dead and silent, even the waters of the great river grew strangely still, the current almost disappearing. Watching the current stop made Sunny feel a deep sense of unease. He had seen the ceaseless flow of the great river halt only once, all those months ago, in the eye of the time storm. Witnessing something similar happening near Twilight made Sunny wary. Just what the hell happened here? Chapter 1496 Bygone Battlefield. They traversed the old battlefield for several more days. By the end of the second week, there were so many dead nightmare creatures and ghostly ships floating in the still water, surrounded by debris and broken weapons, that it became almost impossible to navigate between them. A strange haze hung in the air, limiting how far they could see. With no other choice, Cassie raised the chain breaker higher, and they flew above the scene of harrowing slaughter. The great river was littered with rotten husks of massive abominations, debris, and shattered ships. Shrouded in the somber twilight, they covered the water like a horrid carpet. That carpet stretched into the distance, eventually disappearing in the haze. Sunny was appalled and shaken by this sight. How many people died here? He was no stranger to battlefields, but this one seemed especially somber and poignant. Although there were much less broken ships than there were slain nightmare creatures, this section of the watery battlefield alone must have taken the lives of countless warriors of Twilight. Not all of them had been ascended. After all, desperate to escape a dying world and create an army of saints to reclaim it, Daeron had led most of his surviving subjects here, both awakened and mundane. Before the fall, they had been truly numerous. What is this place? Effie's voice was low. Nephis glanced at her, then looked back at the dreadful scene. It's the outskirts of a battlefield. This is where our predecessors, warriors of the Twilight Sea, faced the defiled Legion of Verge. The Serpent King had once led his people to besiege the cursed city of Verge, but was forced to retreat after failing to destroy the first Seeker. The forces of the Defilement must have launched a war campaign in retaliation, and this was the morbid result. Sunny studied the floating corpses. No wonder the Defiled had been slow in obliterating fallen grace. Was it different during the first cycle? I wonder. The Six Plagues and their tainted army might have been the victors of the Siege of Twilight, but the casualties they had sustained were immeasurably severe. Verge did not possess an infinite number of soldiers, after all. With how many of the defiled abominations seemed to have perished here, in the haze of dawn, there would not be enough of them left to continue an aggressive conquest. Was it different during the first cycle? I wonder. Perhaps, without the Six Plagues, Twilight would still be standing. Same for Weave, and some of the cities ruled by the Sibyls. The cohort would have been able to travel across the Great River, slowly gathering allies and building a vast army to destroy Verge. Sunny and Nephis would have obtained the support of the followers of Weaver, Cassie would have become the saint of the river people, Jet and Effie would have gathered the tribes of the river nomads, and Kai would have earned the trust of the King of Twilight with Mordred's help. But maybe not. Maybe Twilight had always been destined to fall before the new challenges arrived, and the Serpent King had always been destined to descend into madness and become a mindless beast. In any case, that past was gone now, and there was no way to uncover its secrets. Instead, Sunny had to carry the weight of King Daeron's crown, and of Windflower's trust, to finish what the people of the Twilight Sea had started. He gritted his teeth. I'll use your gifts well. Let's proceed. Guided by the light of the sacred relic of the Sibyls, the chain breaker flew above the carpet of dreadful corpses, the broken ships, and the forests of broken weapons. The edge was drawing closer and closer. They could not see far because of the haze, but the wind brought with it distant whispers. The endless waterfall was not that far, by now. Cassie had lowered the speed of the flying ship to a crawl, afraid that something would unexpectedly attack them from below. This way, at least, they would notice an approaching threat in advance. Sunny was peering into the distance when a swift shadow suddenly fell from the sky, and a black crow landed on Jet's shoulder. Her echo had been scouting ahead, and seemed to have brought news. Soul Reaper looked at Crow and raised an eyebrow. What did you find? The crow opened its wings and caught. Shiny. Shiny. Jet frowned. Shiny? You found something shiny. The echo stared at her for a couple of moments, then clicked its beak and flew into the air again. Jet glanced at Cassie. We should probably follow. The blind girl hesitated for a bit, then moved the oar, leading the chain breaker away from the direction where the guiding light was pointing. They continued to fly in the direction which used to be downstream, at the same time moving closer to the edge. After some time, a towering edifice revealed itself from the haze. Unlike the carcasses of the Leviathans, the structure was clearly made by human hands. A mighty wall rose high above the water, crowned with battlements. The base of the wall was littered with massive spikes, as if to prevent the nightmare creatures from reaching it. There were plenty of dead abominations impaled on these spikes. Several enormous chains stretched into the distance from both sides of the structure, disappearing into the haze. It was a floating fortress. Sunny studied the fortress, impressed by how imposing it looked in the dim twilight of the early dawn. However, for every spike that remained whole, more were bent or broken. Most of the massive chains that had been connected to the sides of the fortress once were torn and covered by rust. The mighty walls were breached and had partially collapsed. The battlements were littered with human bones, with tattered flags hanging lifelessly in the forlorn stillness. The ghost fortress stood empty and conquered, and only the rare rattling of rusty chains broke the hollow silence that surrounded it. Crow was heading directly to the battlements. Landing on the parapet of a partially collapsed bastion, the black bird raised its beak and cawed loudly. Its caws echoed above the water, spreading far and wide. Frowning slightly, Cassie brought the chain breaker to a halt. The members of the cohort gathered on the bow, studying the breached fortress. The guiding light was still pointing away from it, so why had Jet's crow brought them here? Sunny was just about to speak when he noticed something from the corner of his eye. Out there, atop the collapsed bastion, something had just shined brightly. Turning his head, he narrowed his eyes with a frown. What is it? A moment later, there was a bright shine again, but it disappeared almost immediately. There was a skeletal corpse in polished steel armor laying on the battlement, its back leaning against the locking mechanism of one of the chains. As the chain swayed in the water, the corpse was pushed lightly up and down. When it moved, soft sunlight reflected from the polished surface of its breastplate, almost as if inviting them to come. Sunny tilted his head. That armor. It was mostly covered in grime, but some of it was clean, revealing lustrous, polished steel. That steel was so perfectly polished, in fact, that it was almost like a mirror. He took a deep breath. It seemed that Mordred, the Prince of Nothing, was welcoming them to Twilight. Chapter 1497 Chain Barrier. The chain breaker rose higher, eventually cresting the wall of the floating stronghold and coming to a stop above the ramparts. From there, they could see a bit further into the haze. Far away to their left, another floating fortress could barely be seen in the dim twilight, just as battered and forlorn as this one. There was one more to their right. All three had been connected by thick chains once, but those had long been torn. Sunny remained motionless for a moment. It's a barrier to block the great river. There must have been a ring of these fortresses built around Twilight once, with massive chains strung between them both above and beneath the water. That way, the Defiled would have had to break through the chain barrier before reaching the city. The other choice would have been to dive much deeper and bypass the fearsome barricade of floating fortresses altogether. But that would have left their backs wide open to retaliation by the garrisons of the Vanguard strongholds. In any case, it was easy to see that the Defiled had chosen to assault the chain barrier directly. The fighting seemed to have been especially harrowing in the vicinity of the fallen fortresses. And beyond them. Sunny shivered. On the other side of the breached stronghold, there were so many floating corpses that he could barely see the water. It was to such a degree that one could probably walk from here to Twilight without getting their boots wet once. Frowning, he placed his hand on the railing. Before he did, however, Sunny hesitated for a moment and looked at his companions. Mordred. The Prince of Nothing was their ally in this nightmare, or at least, he was supposed to be. In truth, it was hard to predict what the devious bastard would do. In the second nightmare, Mordred had slaughtered the entire population of the northern reaches of the Kingdom of Hope, all in pursuit of power. So, he was not someone who was going to have a problem with destroying the remains of the river civilization to achieve his goals. Nor would he feel burdened by releasing the defiled saints into the waking world. In other words, Mordred could have chosen to ally himself with the Six Plagues if he thought that their method of conquering the nightmare was better. However, Sunny was pretty sure that the plagues needed to either kill or defile every human in the tomb of Ariel to win. And, no matter how odious, Mordred was still a human. Unless the Prince of Nothing was ready to surrender his soul to corruption, his only way out of the tomb was to destroy the first Seeker. At least that was what Sunny hoped for, especially because Mordred was the only person who could teach them about Soul Stealer's flaw, or at least use his knowledge of it to slay his past version. Still, Cassie was immune to Mordred's power due to being blind. Nefer's Soul Sea was most likely just as dangerous as Sunnis. If Mordred tried to possess her, he would be incinerated in a radiant inferno of white flame. Jet's shattered soul could not be easily possessed, either, due to how unique her aspect was. But Effie had no defense against the Prince of Nothing. The anvil amulet forged by Mordred's father to protect people against his son was with Kai. Back in the second nightmare, the Huntress had refused to take it in favor of the charming archer. Of course, it wasn't a given that Mordred would be able to defeat Effie in a soul battle. But Sunny did not want to risk it. After hesitating for a moment, he looked at the Huntress and said, "Can you stay and guard the ship?" She frowned a little, but then nodded and forced out a smile. "Sure. You guys go and have fun." With that, she took a step back and leaned on her spear. Sunny took Nefer's hand and pulled her into the shadows. The two of them appeared on the battlements below a moment later, while Jet simply jumped down. Cassie glided down with the help of the quiet dancer and landed elegantly among the weathered corpses. All around them were the skeletal remains of the warriors of Twilight. It was easy to see which had been awakened once, and which had been mundane humans. The former were covered only by rotten fabric, their memory armor long gone. The latter wore suits of armor crafted from the hides of nightmare creatures and sublime steel. The corpse Sunny and his companions were looking for was nearby, resting against the locking mechanism of one of the siege chains. They approached the dead man carefully. Soon, Sunny could see the four of them reflected in the polished breastplate of the dead man. A white skull stared at him eerily from above it, the empty pits of its eyes full of darkness. Sunny had expected to see Mordred hiding in the reflection, but, to his surprise, there were only four figures there: Nephis, Cassie, Jet, and himself. Just what is that bastard planning? For a moment, he was even unsure if Mordred had anything to do with this place. Was it all a coincidence? Then, however, suddenly, Sunny realized that he could not look away from his own reflection. He stared at it, feeling strangely drawn to the polished breastplate, as if an invisible force of attraction was pulling him in. In the next moment, the world seemed to have flipped. Everything remained the same, but also strangely inverted. What was to his right was now to his left, while what was to his left was to his right. Sunny was more or less ambidextrous, but he still favored his left hand. Now, he weirdly felt his right hand was more responsive. The corpse in lustrous armor was still there. The sky was painted pale lilac by the light of dawn. The chain breaker hung above him, with only a few branches of the sacred tree visible from this angle. But only the flying ship was reflecting in the polished breastplate now. The reflections of the cohort were gone. A cold chill ran down his spine. Sunny gritted his teeth. I'm inside of a reflection. He perceived his companions through shadow sense, making sure that they were still with him. Thankfully, they seemed to be unharmed. Before Sunny could ascertain the situation, though, a familiar voice resounded from behind him. It was just as it had been years ago, in the empty darkness of the sky below. My, oh my. Sunless ladies, I am so incredibly glad to see that you've been able to make it. Chapter 1498 Mirror Realm. Sunny slowly turned around and looked behind him, and there he was, the Prince of Nothing. Mordred looked almost exactly like he had the first time Sunny saw his true face. Tall, slender, with raven black hair and a sharp face that wasn't exactly handsome, but possessed a strange beauty to it. His most striking feature, however, were his mirror-like eyes, which reflected the world back on itself like two pools of liquid silver. There was a pleasant, but hollow smile on Mordred's lips. Wait, something is wrong. Sunny frowned. The last time he had seen the Prince of Nothing, moments before entering the Seed of Nightmare, the bastard was battered and bruised, covered in dried blood, and missing a hand. But now, Mordred looked perfectly fine. There were no wounds on his body and no blood stains on his tunic. Even his hand was back, as if it had never been severed. Mordred's smile widened slightly when he noticed Sunny's gaze. Raising the hand in question, he waved at them. It doesn't seem like I've been missed. How hurtful. Sunny lingered for a moment, then asked cautiously, where are we? The space surrounding them looked like one of the floating fortresses of Twilight's chain barrier, but it was also different. Not even mentioning the fact that the entire world had flipped from left to right, there seemed to be a limit to this place. Not too far away from them, the dreadful battlefield disappeared, turning into pure nothing. It was as though someone had erased most of the world, leaving only a small island of matter drifting in the sea of nothingness. It only encompasses what is reflected in the polished breastplate. Sunny felt a chill when he realized that fact. It seemed that his theory that Mordred had somehow pulled them into a reflection was correct. Indeed, the space they had found themselves in only contained a part of the world that reflected in the lustrous breastplate of the withered corpse, and a small area around it. The Prince of Nothing looked around, then raised his hands in a welcoming gesture. Let's call it the Mirror Realm. Consider it an extension of my ascended ability. In a sense, it is. Sunny did not like the sound of these words at all. Neither did his companions. Frowning slightly, Nephis placed her hand on the hilt of her sword and asked in an even tone. In a sense. Mordred hesitated. Well, it's a long story. Sadly, time is a luxury that we can't afford at the moment. Cassie tilted her head a little. Why not? He gave her a guarded look, then looked around with discomfort. There are dangers prowling in this mirror realm, just like there are outside it. I have already taken a considerable risk by coming to warn you. Do not continue on your way to Twilight, otherwise, you will never come back. His ominous warning hung between them, turning the eerie atmosphere of the fallen fortress even more frightening. Sunny took a deep breath, then asked in a dark tone. Why? Aren't you here? And where is Kai? You haven't done anything to him, have you? Because, if you did, you better start praying to the dead gods. Mordred stared at him for a moment. So much hostility. Granted, I might have deserved such treatment, a bit, but don't fret. Your friend should still be alive. In fact, I'm quite confident that he is. As for how I am able to hold this conversation, you are mistaken. I am not, in fact, here. My reflection is, while my body is lost somewhere in Twilight. If you want to know more, though, you'll have to come with me to somewhere we'll be safe from the monster roaming this mirror realm. You might not value your lives, but I do. Sunny shook his head. That is not good enough. What monster are you talking about? And what do you mean, your body is lost? Was it destroyed? Are you a mirror ghost again? The Prince of Nothing looked at him with a somber expression. It's not nice to call people ghosts, Sunless. Sunny scoffed. Since when am I a nice person? Just answer the questions, damn it. Mordred sighed. My body is not destroyed. It's just trapped within the city. As far as I was able to ascertain, it has something to do with the enchantment array that was set up by the inhabitants of Twilight. In any case, I can't freely move in the physical world. The same goes for your friend, Nightingale. The difference is that I am able to escape into the mirrors, while he can't. It's for the best, really, even I have barely survived here. Sunny wanted to say something, but Nephis interrupted him. Raising a hand, she said impassively, "One of us stayed back to guard the ship. Is she in danger, as well?" Mordred shook his head. "As long as the ship does not come closer to Twilight, she'll be fine. It is us, the visitors of the Mirror Realm, who are in danger. However, this is also the only place where we can talk, unless one of you is willing to surrender your body to me, of course." He glanced at them and grinned. "I guess none of you are, though." Sunny gritted his teeth and growled, his voice full of threatening malice. "You're goddamn right. Don't even think about it." Mordred sighed. "Well, then. I don't have much essence left, but it's enough to invite one more person." With that, there was a sound of ringing glass, and Effie was suddenly standing near them, a perplexed expression on her face. However, it was the Prince of Nothing who looked truly startled. His usual mask of pleasant friendliness cracked for a moment, revealing a hint of sincere bewilderment. Staring at Effie's belly, Mordred remained silent for a few moments, and then said incredulously, "Ascended Athena, why are you?" Hearing that, Effie smiled sweetly. "Pregnant? Well, you see, Your Highness, when a man and a woman love each other very much." Sunny's face twitched. "No way. Was it really happening?" Chapter 1499 Prince's Old Clothes. While Effie was giving Mordred, who silently listened to her with a strange expression on his usually composed face, the talk about the birds and the bees, Sunny secretly looked around. A mirror realm. He had never learned what Mordred's ascended ability was, and he did not really know now, either. But it seemed to have something to do with establishing a physical space in the realm of reflections, or at least a space capable of containing physical items and living things. So, in a sense, Mordred carried within himself a pocket dimension, similar to Effie's supreme memory. It was a pure utility ability. But there were still many questions about its reach and extent. For example, could any reflection become an entrance to this mirror realm? No, he had called it a mirror realm. So could there be many of such realms? What was the scope of the space he could create? What were its limitations? The idyllic meadow inside Effie's locket, for example, was around 3 kilometers across. Additionally, while she could send people and creatures inside without asking for permission, it was easy to escape. All one had to do was reach the edge of the small world and attack its painted boundaries. With enough force, the fabric of the pocket dimension would come undone, and the locket would be damaged. What about Mordred's mirror realm? He had already shown the ability to pull people inside against their will, even from some distance. How would one escape being trapped in a reflection? What powers did Mordred possess within this mirror world that he did not have outside? More than that, could it be connected to two reflections at the same time, serving as a bridge between two physical places? There were too many questions. No, I'm thinking about it wrong. The Prince of Nothing had not said that this was a manifestation of his ascended ability. He had said that it was an extension of it. How had his ability been extended? Who had extended it? And why was there a monster roaming its expanse, one dangerous enough to make Mordred wary? Who could invade Mordred's mirror realm? A dark expression appeared on Sunny's face. He could think of an answer. And that answer was not at all to his liking. Finally, Mordred cleared his throat and interrupted Effie. "I see. That, please accept my sincere congratulations. I guess? Congratulations. But we've already spent too much time here. It's time to leave." Before any of them could say anything, the world around them rippled. In the next moment, they found themselves somewhere else, a place much different from the fallen fortress. Sunny tensed. There was a vast and somber expanse around them. The grey sky was covered by stormy clouds. The surface beneath their feet was shrouded in white mist. The whole space was suffused with soft light, and there, high above, a single radiant sphere was shining like a sun, its pale rays falling through the veil of storm clouds. It seemed as though vague symbols were carved into the surface of the sun, but Sunny could not see them clearly. This place resembled a soul sea. Turning his head slightly, Sunny flinched. There were motionless figures standing in a row in front of him. For a moment, he even mistook them for the silent shadows, but no, they weren't shadows. They were people, standing in the mist with empty expressions and hollow eyes. A handsome young man wearing stylish clothes of the waking world. A woman with a weathered face, wearing cheap synthetic attire. A hunched old man in a plain suit similar to those the government officials wore. A broad-shouldered warrior clad in a suit of armor in the colors of Clan Vela, who looked familiar. A young woman in the uniform of the evacuation army, and a few more. There were several nightmare creatures among them, as well, each more repulsive than the previous one. They were Mordred's bodies. Noticing Sunnis' appalled gaze, the Prince of Nothing grinned. Perusing my wardrobe? I hope you don't mind. Sunny gritted his teeth and looked at his companions, who all stared at the hollow bodies with repulsed expressions. He shook his head and turned away. Mordred chuckled. Why, don't look at me as if I'm some kind of monster. These people weren't using their bodies well, anyway. Like this one. He patted the handsome young man on the shoulder. I took his body while he was dangling in a noose. That one had only a few excruciating hours left to live, her body full of poison from years of toil in an underground factory. This one, well, this one was surprisingly healthy. But his had siphoned the credits meant for security measures and falsified inspection results to keep the factory running. Ah, well, the one next to him is a retainer of Clan Vela. Enough said. Mordred shook his head. I too have standards, you know. Then, noticing Sunnis' unconvinced gaze, and perhaps remembering the time he tried to steal Sunnis' own body for no reason whatsoever, apart from convenience, he added with an elegant smile. When it suits me. In any case, we should be safe here. This space is mine and mine alone. Sunny took a deep breath, then looked around. Finally, he showed a sign of interest. Is this, you Soul Sea? Mordred took a few steps forward, his feet drowning in the swirling mist, and stopped beneath the pale sun. It is a reflection of my Soul Sea, technically. This is the true manifestation of my ascended ability. Sunny remained silent for a moment. Suddenly, he remembered the day Nightmare had come into his true power as a terror, unlocking the Dream Curse ability. I wonder, this ascended ability of his. Could it be called a lesser mirror domain? But then, he frowned. Wait, if this is your mirror realm, then what was that reflection at the floating fortress? Mordred smiled silently. What else? It's a manifestation of the same ability, just not mine. My powers are not grand enough to encompass an entire city, let alone its surroundings. I simply snuck there like a thief. The true master of that place. He grew silent for a moment and then added in a displeased tone. Is a rather unpleasant fellow. I think he goes by Soul Stealer. Chapter 1500 Perfect Trap. What? The members of the cohort all stared at Mordred, their expressions grim. Noticing their reaction, he smiled. I was rather surprised to learn about the identities of these 6 plagues, but it seems that you are already familiar with them. Good. It will spare me the explanations. At that moment, Jet, who had been keeping quiet until then, finally spoke. Soul Stealer is here, in Twilight. Mordred remained silent for a few moments. Eventually, he sighed. He is. I've been playing hide and seek with him for, gods, I don't even know